I'm Josephine. Standing in front of the old house I once called home, the sun is setting, casting a warm glow over the porch. The door stands ajar, and inside, I can see the moving boxes. It's finally over, but the journey to get here was long and arduous. It all started that fateful night when I returned from a grueling 16-hour shift at the Evergreen construction site. I was bone-tired, with my shoulders aching from lifting rain-soaked steel beams and my hands throbbing from rope burns. All I wanted was a hot shower, a decent meal, and some peace. As I pulled up in front of the house on Elm Street, the place where I'd spent so many happy childhood memories with my late mother, I noticed little had changed on the outside. The old oak tree in the front yard still swayed gently in the evening breeze. I climbed the porch steps, my duffel bag weighing me down, and inserted my key into the lock. But it wouldn't turn. I jiggled it, tried again, but it was as if the lock had suddenly decided I was a stranger. Then, the door opened, and there stood Vivian. She was my stepmother, a woman with a calculating look in her eyes and a smug smile on her face. Her long, perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she was dressed in expensive yoga clothes. Behind her, her son, Ethan, was sprawled on the couch, wearing my favorite college sweatshirt. "You're back early," Vivian said, as if the non-working lock was no big deal. "The key doesn't work," I told her, my voice hoarse from the dust at the construction site. "We changed the locks," she replied calmly, "for safety." Her tone made it clear whose safety she was referring to, and the sight of Ethan munching on chips from a bag I'd bought only confirmed my suspicions. My fingers tightened around the useless key. I stepped back onto the porch, feeling the cold air bite at my skin. I could sense the fight that was about to unfold. Vivian didn't waste any time. She crossed her arms and pulled out a folded piece of paper from the counter. "You've fallen behind on rent, utilities, and household contributions," she said, tapping the columns she'd neatly written. "You owe us $50,000. Pay up, and you can stay." Ethan let out a low whistle and tossed his phone on the couch. "That's just one good paycheck, right?" "You'll be fine," he said with a grin, pulling my sweatshirt tighter around his shoulders. I looked past Vivian's smug expression, noticing the fresh screws on the strike plate and a locksmith's card half covered by a scented candle on the hall table. "Did my father approve this?" I asked, my voice steady but the words rough in my throat. Vivian's smirk didn't waver. "Your father is on a long-term business trip overseas. This is my house now, and I make the rules." I realized then that this wasn't about money or fairness. It was about power. I let the silence stretch between us, my hand loosening on the key. Without a word, I turned and walked down the steps, the cold night air stinging my face. As I walked back to my truck, memories of the house flooded my mind. After my mother's death, my father, Henry, remarried quickly. Vivian had come into our lives with her designer boxes, replacing the warm, homey atmosphere my mother had created. The pictures of my mother on the walls were taken down and replaced with generic landscape prints. The smell of my mother's homemade cookies was replaced with the artificial scent of lavender sprays, and the refrigerator was stocked with Ethan's energy drinks. My father thought he was giving me stability by going on overseas contracts, but the house never felt like home again. Whenever there was a problem, like a leaky faucet or a rattling furnace, it was me who fixed it. I carried the weight of the house on my shoulders, just like I carried the rebar at work, hoping someone would notice my efforts. But no one ever did. On my 21st birthday, my father had flown back briefly. He took me to a notary's office downtown. The place smelled of old paper and ink. He handed me some documents without much explanation, saying it was for my security. I signed where he pointed, half confused, wondering why my birthday gift was so formal. When I asked what it meant, he told me to keep the red file safe, maybe never to open it. "Think of it as a map," he said. "One you may never have to unfold." I'd tucked that red file away in the lockbox of my truck, trusting my father's words. Now, standing in the cold street after Vivian's demand, I knew exactly where that map was. I refused to stand on the porch like a beggar, waiting for permission to enter my own home. I drove to the construction site. The skeletal frame of the building loomed against the night sky, with tarps flapping in the wind. I pulled out my duffel from the truck and spread it on a plywood platform under the scaffolding. I wrapped a neon safety vest around me for warmth. It wasn't comfortable, but it was mine, and no one could change the locks on this concrete structure. The night was heavy, and I lay flat, listening to the rain patter through the gaps in the tarp. I thought of the house as it used to be, filled with the love of my mother. Those memories filled the cold air around me, and for once, I didn't push them away. Before dawn, I sat up and reached into the lockbox behind my seat. The red file was still there, its edges worn from being moved around. My hands hesitated, but then I pulled it out. Inside were 3 pieces of recorded deed naming me the sole owner of the property on Elm Street, dated on my 21st birthday, a limited power of attorney for emergencies, and an unsigned letter in my father's handwriting. As I read the letter, my hands trembled. "If you ever feel the air get tight at home, this is why," it said. I'd been carrying the proof of my ownership all these years without knowing it. It was a weapon wrapped in silence. By the time the courthouse clock struck 8, I was walking up Main Street, the red file pressed against my ribs like armor. I hadn't slept much after opening it, but the memory of Vivian's smirk was more unbearable than my exhaustion. I stopped in front of a small brick building with a plaque on the glass that read, Mr. Foster, Attorney at Law. Inside, the office smelled of old wood polish and fresh coffee. Mr. Foster himself looked nothing like the flashy lawyers on TV. His hair was thinning, and his tie was slightly askew, but his eyes held a kind of patience that comes from years of dealing with people in difficult situations. I sat across from him and opened the red file. I told him everything, how Vivian had changed the locks, how she demanded $50,000 in back rent, and how Ethan had laughed while wearing my sweatshirt. My voice wavered only once when I described trying to open the door with the useless key. Mr. Foster listened without interrupting. He simply nodded, glanced at the papers, and made a few notes. When I finished, he tapped the deed. "This is clear and valid," he said. "We'll let the law handle this. Washington law requires you to serve a 20-day notice to terminate the month-to-month tenancy. If they refuse, we file an unlawful detainer case in the county court." I frowned. "So, I can't just change the locks back?" He cut in gently. "No, that's self-help eviction, and it's illegal. You need to document everything, calls, texts, demands. Let the court see who's being reasonable." His calmness gave me direction. We arranged for a professional process server to deliver the notice. Mr. Foster gave me a checklist for an evidence binder, including photographs, bills, and proof of payment. That night, I sat in my truck, a yellow pad on my knee. The deed was open beside me. Anger tempted me to write in all caps, but I remembered Mr. Foster's words. I wrote, "No rent is owed. I am the recorded owner. Enclosed is the 20-day notice to terminate occupancy. Any further communication regarding this matter should be directed to my attorney." I typed it up, printed 2 copies, and sent one by certified mail to Vivian. At dawn, the process server drove off with the envelope, leaving me to wait. I parked 2 blocks away from the house and watched through the hedges. At 9 o'clock sharp, Vivian stepped out in her slippers, phone in hand, and a mug of coffee. She picked up the envelope and tore it open. A scream that could be heard down the street followed. Ethan stumbled out, his hair a mess and my sweatshirt slipping off his shoulder. He grabbed the papers and started cursing. Moments later, he was filming a video, calling me heartless and a traitor to the family. Comments flooded in from strangers, distant cousins, and old acquaintances, all cursing my name. But I didn't respond. Instead, I screenshotted every post, saved every voicemail, and noted every name. I knew proof was for the judge, not for likes or outrage. Over the next 20 days, Vivian didn't stay quiet. She called the police, claiming I was harassing her. But when I showed them the deed and the notice, they said it was a civil matter. She also threatened a restraining order, but nothing came of it. She started telling relatives that my father had promised the house to her and Ethan, but without any legal proof. I met with Mr. Foster a few more times. He told me to keep photographing the property and logging all the utilities I'd paid for. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly neighbor, confirmed she'd seen a locksmith's van outside the day before the locks were changed and offered to testify. As the deadline approached, anonymous texts urged me to show mercy, but mercy, as they defined it, meant giving up my home. I copied each message into the binder. When the deadline passed and Vivian still refused to leave, Mr. Foster filed the unlawful detainer case. A few days later, we were in the county court. Vivian was dressed in a too-crisp blazer, her hair pulled back tight, and her eyes full of defiance. Ethan sat behind her, fidgeting with his phone. When the case was called, Vivian launched into a story about family equity and promises my father had made. But when asked for proof, she had none. Mr. Foster presented the deed, the 20-day notice, and the evidence binder. My name was repeated throughout the pages. The judge's decision was swift. Possession is restored to the plaintiff. A writ of restitution will be issued, and any interference is prohibited. Vivian's mouth opened to argue, but the judge's gavel came down. Outside the court, Ethan was still ranting into his phone, but Mr. Foster guided me away without a word. The order was in hand, and the date for the eviction was set. As I stood on the curb, waiting for the deputy to arrive, a familiar car pulled up. My father stepped out. He looked thinner but more determined. "Josephine," he said, his voice low. "I've filed for divorce. I should have done it sooner. I see what I've put you through." He explained that the deed was his way of protecting me while he was away. He'd always feared this day might come. The sheriff's deputy arrived, and under his watch, Vivian and Ethan packed their things and left. At the doorway, Vivian turned to me and said, "You owe us for family." But my father stepped forward. "Family doesn't invoice belonging," he said firmly. By sunset, the house was quiet again. I stepped inside, walking barefoot on the hardwood floors. I flipped on the lights, not out of fear but as a celebration. I hung the framed photo of my mother back on the wall where it belonged. I changed the locks, and this time, the keys were mine. The scar on the door from the locksmith's drill would be fixed. Over the next few days, I took care of the details, forwarding the court order to the utilities, closing unauthorized accounts, and drafting a final letter to end any further contact. As I locked the front door with my new key, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a new beginning, a place where I could rebuild my life on my own terms. The walls held my memories, and the silence was mine. I knew that from now on, the story of this house would be my own.